Hello everyone, this is Edgar with Team Lotus Box, and today I'm going to be talking about some Legacy. This coming weekend is Eternal Weekend, pretty recently announced, and I've been putting in some work because I am very excited to play that this weekend. Probably one of my favorite tournaments every year, and this year is going to be even more challenging with all the added competition for it being online, so really hoping to do well and really been putting a lot of work into this format. And after playing a bunch of decks, I have come to the conclusion, and this is something I've been saying for a while, but I've kind of just reinforced what I was believing through testing this week, that um, I think it's a pretty big mistake not to play Rug Delver in this format, and that does sound pretty unfortunate, but this deck is just really feels like the only thing that has the tools to really combat what everyone else is doing, and every other deck just seems to have some sort of fundamental flaw. And it's not even one of those things like some top decks in formats, not necessarily legacy, not necessarily current formats, but sometimes a top deck will have a weakness, but that weakness is not something that's prevalent. But to me, it feels like every other deck besides Delver just has a weakness that actually is prevalent in the format. Because legacy is honestly pretty diverse right now. People are playing a really wide variety of things. You see people playing Snow Piles, Sneak and Show, Hogak is on the rise, Death and Taxes is still prevalent, Reanimator, etc. Elves even is back. So lots of things going on, and it really just feels like Temur Delver is the only one that can be toe to toe against all those things. So yeah, that's why I decided to play this. I really wish I could find a snow deck that I liked, but unfortunately, it just doesn't beat Delver as consistently as it needs to in order to go toe to toe. So, just gonna be talking about some of the specific card choices I made for this weekend. I don't think I'm gonna be changing very much in the next coming days. I've been pretty happy with all the choices. The deck is pretty stock at this point. I guess you can say there are only a few flex slots in the main deck, and the sideboard is you see a lot of the same things. But I'll just talk about my specific choices. So in terms of stuff that I would consider non-negotiable, are definitely the threats being the 4 Delver Secrets and 4 Dreadhorde Arcanist, and the first 2 copies of Oko. These 10 cards to me just feel like must includes. If you're not playing 4 copies of Arcanist, I really just think you're making a huge mistake. And I see a lot of people playing 2 or 3 of this card in favor of some other threats, and I just really don't think I would really not recommend that. It's This card just does things in matchups that no other card does. It snowballs better than almost any other threat. It has a lasting long-term impact even after it gets removed if it's just attacked 2 or 3 times. So really, really important in my eyes. And to round out my threats, I am playing the 3rd copy of Oko, which is pretty common at this point, but I wouldn't say is as guaranteed or as necessary as the first 2. The first 2 really, really important for some matchups. You do get to play this deck more as a mid-range Delver deck than some of the more traditional aggressive Delver decks of past. So think more like the Deathrite Delver deck or the Lurrus Delver decks of past. This deck is more akin to those. So really having these strong mid-range threats for some matchups is super important. And another thing about Oko that I think gets understated is the ability to have an answer in your deck for cards that were previously problematic for Delver that just aren't anymore. I'm talking cards like Chalice of the Void, Ensnaring Bridge, just these types of cards that would sometimes get you in game one, and a lot of decks, a lot of builds of Delver would have no outs to in game one. Once it entered play, it just gives you answers to those, and kind of gives you a more robust game plan. So really, really like Oko in this deck. I do like the 3rd copy. Something that I'm playing that I think is probably more uncommon than these other choices, though, are these 3 copies of Hooting Mandrills. And I think the more common build has like 2 Mangroves and 2 Goyfs, playing one more threat than I am, which I will get to later as to where that slot is coming from. But I have been really, really happy with Mandrills and really, really unhappy with Tarmogoyf as a threat. Tarmogoyf is a card that is super powerful in the Delver mirror, and Delver is the most played deck, so it's really, really tempting inclusion. but in my eyes, it's really just not that powerful in basically any other matchup. Not having trample is pretty relevant against stuff like Mother of Runes, stuff like the Ice Fang Kodos. You still get like 3 points of chip damage that Tarmogoyf wouldn't. And really, the only relevance for Tarmogoyf is just outsizing the other threats in the Delver Mirror in my eyes, and I really just don't think that's enough of a reason. And as I was trying Tarmogoyf again this week, because I did want to just make sure I wasn't like too wrong about that, I was actually kind of um, how do I say, it was less good than I thought it was going to be in the mirror. It is certainly better than mangroves in the mirror, but I don't think it's actually by that wide of a margin anymore. And the reason for that is I feel like more than ever, mana advantage in a mirror can be really, really huge. People are playing a lot of copies of Submerge. Obviously, they're gonna have a bunch of Dazes and um, just like lightning bolts backed up by soft permission, and I just think being able to double spell is so much more important in a lot of spots. And I think that really closes the gap between Mangroves and Tarmogoyf, and once I realized that, I think the decision for me was easy, because if people are, if I've in my eyes, if Tarmogoyf is only for the mirror match and it's by less of a gap than I thought so originally, it just gives me way more reason to play Mangroves. So I've been really happy with Mangroves. The 1 mana threat is so relevant against the combo decks, which I'll speak to later because there's another point about that. But it just, the fact that it can cost 1 in a lot of spots, I think is super, super important. So these are the 14 threats that I'm playing. I've been pretty happy with them. Most people have 15. The reason I have 1 fewer is because I'm playing more cantrips than most people, I believe. I have 3 copies of Preordain, and if we come over to here, the counter magic, the reason I'm doing that is because I actually have a 7th copy of Force in my deck, where most people have fewer of these. And the reason for that is the combo decks, I believe, are on the rise right now. They seem to be more prevalent than before. Stuff like Doomsday and Sneaky Show specifically are the 2 decks I'm worried about. And both of those decks are playing their own soft permission or copies of Veil of Summer, if it's Omnitel. So Sneaky Show has Daze. Doomsday has Daze sometimes, or like Flusterstorm, stuff like that, and then Omnita has Veil of Summer, and I think it's super, super important to have multiple pieces of cheap, ideally 0 mana disruption, which is why I'm trying to play additional copies of Force rather than stuff like Spell Pierce or Spell Snare, stuff like that, because you really need to have multiple threats. And since I have these extra copies of Force, I really need to make sure that I'm maintaining my blue card count for some of these matchups. And the way I'm doing that, or part of the reason I want to do that, is this additional copy of Preordain. I could even see a 4th. I've been trying to squeeze that in, maybe over the 5th bolt effect, but it's a tough squeeze. And the extra copy of Preordain really does help to facilitate the more Hooting Mandrills I have than most builds. So kind of a like a big package deal here, like kind of a consistent deck building thing that I have. Just really feel like you need to have a lot of cheap disruption, and going back to Mandrills costing 1 mana, that's another thing that's relevant against these Daze combo decks or these Veil of Summer combo decks. So really want to emphasize that. But yeah, those are the flex slots, like this 1 Preordain or 2 Preordains, this additional Force, and then these threats that I was talking about. Um, some people have a 6th copy of Bolt, the second Chain Lightning, and I've kind of hedged for that in the sideboard instead. Again, though, that's mostly for the Delver Mirror, I would say. Of course, it helps against stuff like Death and Taxes, it helps against Elves, but I'm not too worried about that, and I do think that I only want 5 because I do want to fit this 7th Force because I'm more worried about the combo decks. I do want this additional blue card in my deck to facilitate the extra forces and the extra cantrip for the Mandrills. So that's why I chose to build my main deck the way I did. And since I am weaker than most builds in the main deck, as we segue to the sideboard, I do have more copies of Submerge than most people. This is a card that is super powerful in the Delver Mirror, and I think it has playing more copies of this card, and I could even see myself going up to the 4th copy. I think playing more copies of this card actually probably just has a bigger impact in your overall deck construction than just playing a couple copies of Tarmogoyf in the mirror match. And So that's why I opted to have more Submerges and then just build my main deck how I like it in all the other matches instead, and then kind of hedge my bets this way. But Submerge is just so good. I talked a lot already about how mana advantage is pretty huge in these Delver mirrors now, so this card obviously being a 0 mana removal spell really swings the board states. To go to the other cards on my sideboard, these Klothyses are definitely cards that have been overperforming for me. They are really good against the snow decks. The way the snow decks are built right now, I think most of them have very few, if not zero, answers to Klothys, and this card is pretty capable of just winning games on its own. Uh, Obviously, if you're too far behind already, like if they already have an Uro active, or they're just so far ahead on the Planeswalker advantage, or God forbid have a Teferi on 4 already, this card's going to be pretty embarrassing, but those are usually lost games anyways. If you're at parity or even just slightly ahead, this card is able to just close the door more effectively than any other card I've played in this slot. And it's also been somewhat effective in the mirror match for similar reasons, because games do tend to slow down after board, and it doesn't get red blasted, which is a pretty huge deal both in the snow matchup and the mirror. So I've been really happy with these Klothys. These 3 Pyroblasts, similar vein. Actually considering more copies of this as well because of Show and Tell being on the rise, Sneak and Show and Omnitel. Uh, Honestly, not too much I can say about Pyroblast. Just a legacy staple, very powerful in the blue matchups. Just 1 mana removal or counter, whatever you need. Sylvan Library is something you see pretty commonly, just good in the grinding matchups. For my graveyard hate, I am playing Soul Guide Lantern, which I think isn't the most common. Again, that's a nod to the Hogak matchup, which is kind of on the rise. It's kind of a complicated matchup. I'm not actually positive how good it is, but I do think that Soul Guide Lantern helps a lot compared to other pieces of graveyard hate. You really need to clear their whole yard when you're playing against Hogak. There's no one thing you can tag with like a surgical extraction effect to really ensure victory, but Soul Guide Lantern does have a pretty high impact on the game. So I think having these as your piece of graveyard hate is pretty relevant, and the reason I'm playing this over Tormod's Crypt, which I think would also be effective, is because I've incorporated it into my ratios for the Uro matchup. Against the Uro decks, you can board this in, you can play it, tag their Uro, really important in games where you don't have Klothys, of course, and then usually you end up cycling it instead of just getting their whole yard, but of course it depends on the game, you can do both. But yes, with Hogak being as popular as it is, and I have not played against traditional Black-Red Reanimator in a long time, I think a lot of those people have moved off that deck. So I think that this is the right inclusion over something like Surgical. And you don't really need Surgical against stuff like lands anymore either. Between Klothys and Oko, it's kind of not really about that anymore. Uh, for my sweeper type effects, I do have 1 Blazing Volley, 1 Engineered Explosives. These are the cards I'm most unsure about. The reason I don't have 2 of one or 1 of the other is just for versatility. EE can also come in against Chalice decks. Blazing Volley obviously a little bit better with Arcanist, so you get a little bit of synergy there. I do have more cantrips than normal, so having high impact 1-ofs can definitely come up. But yeah, just good catch-alls. I do bring in 1 of these effects against Empty the Warrens as well. And they're just nice to have. Engineered Explosives is really good against stuff like Eldrazi as well, where they could have endless ones, chalices, multiple chalices, or multiple 2-mana rocks, or anti-mana rocks, I suppose. And the last card of my sideboard, Return to Nature. This is the card that I think a lot of people play like Ancient Grudge or a Braid or some sort of split in the slot. The reason I really think Return to Nature is kind of twofold. The first thing is just the card Rest in Peace. The card Rest in Peace is actually a pretty big nightmare for the way I have the deck built, and just against Rug Delver in general. It does shut down about half of my threats, right? It takes out the Mangroves and the Arcanist basically outright and leaves me with just Okos and Delvers. And against Rest in Peace decks, that can be quite the liability. So I think it's pretty important to have anti-enchantment stuff, and Engineered Explosives does kind of overlap with that a bit. Rather than just pure shatters. And to branch on that, the addition of Oko has made it less necessary for your anti-shatter to be a repeated shatter. Something like Ancient Grudge used to be really powerful against like Death and Taxes, for example, because you could answer two of their things, and that's usually good enough. But I think I would rather have. I think only being able to answer one thing with this card is less of a big deal. Now that you can just use it to bridge the gap to Oko to answer the rest of the things. So being able to tag an enchantment really important, and just the way that the decks are built after board, the decks you're playing against, there are a bunch of matchups where you don't actually know for sure what type of card they're gonna have. So against Snow, for example, cards that you can see but you won't necessarily always see. They could have Carpet of Flowers. They could have Back to Basics. Just these random cards that you kind of want to hedge for, but can be too much of a liability to bring pure answers against. And this is the type of card that is always going to be at least somewhat reasonable when they don't have that hate piece, and you want to bring in a hedge card. So against Snow, you can board this in. If they have Carpet, you can deal with it. If not, you can use it to deal with an Uro possibly. Against stuff like the combo decks, Sneak and Show, or Omnitel, or Storm, you don't know if they're going to have Carpet, you don't know if they're going to have Defense Grid. They have a wide variety of possible cards. Nothing is really set in stone in terms of their sideboard building, and you really need to make sure your cards are going to always line up, and I think that's really important for the way I have the deck built, so that's why I'm opting to play Return to Nature. But yeah, basically that's the gist of where I'm at. Really high on mangroves, really low on Tarmogoyf, really high on Submerge. I don't think it's completely necessary to build your game 1 deck for the mirror as long as you adequately prepare for it in the sideboard. I have a lot of cards here after board that I think are super effective, so pretty sure I'm going to be playing something really close to this for Eternal Weekend this weekend. If you were playing yourself, I would definitely recommend putting in some reps with Delver. I think it is far and away the best deck. It just does stuff way better than everything else, and definitely worth getting familiar with because, of course, these blue decks in Legacy can be really complicated to play. But yep, that's about it. Feel free to reach out with any questions if you may have it, and I will see you all next time.